Hi everyone, welcome to another painting tutorial from Promethean Paints. Today I'm going to show you how I painted the Librarian from the Armageddon box set, which is the new box set for 11th edition. Really nice dynamic pose, and I added the 3D bit from Deadly Print Studios. You can buy them as STLs or as the bits themselves, so I just ordered them the bits. They only take a couple of days to get delivered. It was a double parted flame smoke trail, and I just snipped the two ends off and glue it onto the end of the spear. So I've built the model complete, added some stuff onto the bottom of the base just for the like the train to match the other models in the army. There's a few stages here where we're going to be using the airbrush and then blocking in colours and then using the airbrush again, adding some different glosses as well, just so that we get the finishes that we need. The first main goal here is to get the armor color, which is blue for Librarian. So of course you can use this across any sort of faction, because the lore wise Librarians are generally blue. So to get our blue armor, we're going to start off with the Liquitex white ink, but any white ink is fine. I just find the Liquitex stuff is pretty good. It can be thinned down as well. Now we are in the middle of a heat wave in the UK, so I have had to thin down the white ink with a little bit of airbrush thinner and flow improver, and there are going to be multiple times where I'm cleaning the tip of the airbrush because it was drying out really quick. It was over sort of 35 degrees in the office, even though I had the aircon on. It was just really hot. So it's okay to airbrush in hot conditions, but just thin your paints down a little bit more, just so they dry out too quick. Now the idea here with the white ink is just to get some volumetric base going. So what I want to do is just highlight where I want the blue to be brightest, and leaving black or only a couple of sprays of the white ink in the shadow areas. So where the most sort of intense white ink areas are is where the most colour will shine through. So we're going to be using contrast paint after this to get the blue down. So where it's going to be white is where there's most blue and brighter ink, and in the shadows and recesses where we leave it dark. So the skill here really is to just use the airbrush naturally halo effects, tilting the airbrush and the angles of the model to match where you want that intenseness to be. Remember, where you point the central of the nozzle is where the most paint is going to be left. Use short, sharp sprays from your airbrush so that you don't get any pooling or webbing happening. As soon as you see that paint hit the model and it looks shiny, move away, because that means it's really wet. So if you start to add more and more paint to that area before it dries, it will just start pooling, spider webbing, and look awful. I use the Army Matte Painters matte black as my primer. Any dark primer will do. You could even use a dark grey if you wanted to. And the idea here is just to work your way around the model, just getting that intensity of white where you want your blue to really shine through. And then once you're happy, give the airbrush a good clean out. So we're using contrast paints straight into the airbrush. I'm using Tallasar blue. You could use Frostheart blue, but that was really bright, and I wanted our glowing effects to sort of be the dominating effect here. If you aren't going to do the glowing effect and you just want to use a blue, then the Frostheart blue is equally as good. I generally use that for the ultramarines. Tallasar blue, a little bit darker, a little bit richer, and it does mean the glowing effects we're doing do stand out a bit more. That's where I wanted the intensity of colour to be. So the idea here is just basically now we're just spraying over almost the entire model, but you want to be a bit careful. Try and aim for where you've done the white ink, so that you don't get too much contrast paint over everything. And it's just multiple layers now, very thin sharp sprays. The contrast paint is all, it's almost as thin as water, so it comes out of the airbrush really quick. So just take your time, a couple of short sharp bursts, move on to the next area, and just keep working around the model, almost like we do with layering with a brush, multiple thin layers. Too much straight away and you'll just flood the area. It will cause spider webbing and running and all sorts of horridness. So just take your time, multiple layers, work around, and when you're happy with the the coverage, give it a few minutes to dry, and it will usually dry by the time you've gone and cleaned your airbrush out. When it comes to cleaning out an airbrush, I don't really use anything fancy. I use just normal cold water, fill the the cap up with water, spray it through under a tap, and just washing it through there, and then just run it through with cold water straight through the airbrush into a special little sort of airbrush spray thing that I've got, which I'm going to do a video soon to show you sort of all the bits and bobs that I use. But you can get sort of like an airbrush cup, which you spray into. It doesn't go everywhere, just to clean it out. But yeah, I generally, the only things I ever use that are specialist are the airbrush thinners to clean it through. I don't use airbrush cleaner or anything like that. Water for me is good enough. Once I'm done with this, that's the sort of armour based, and then I want to start adding in my glowing effects. So I want to just base coat everything else back to the original primer colour, which was the black. So any matte black primer, use that just to because now these glowing effects are going to affect quite a bit of stuff. Now I'm using the Mr. Weathering inks here, white ink, oil based. I'm just grabbing the bottle now. So yeah, it's called Mr. Weathering Colour, and it's a white oil based paint that is heavily thinned down, and so it just naturally flows into all those little gaps. You can make this yourself. You could just buy some white ink, some decent white ink like from Daler and Rowney, oil based, and then thin it down with some odorless thinners. I use the AK odorless thinners, and just thin it down until you get a good consistency so it flows. But I find this Mr. Weathering, it's done it for me. I haven't got to worry about mixing it all myself, and then where am I going to put that? I got it from Amazon. It's only a few pounds for a bottle, and it lasts an absolute age. It's already a good consistency. If you wanted to thin it down more, you can just pour some into a little tub and thin it down with a little bit of thinners. But I find this is really good. And all I do here is I use an old liner brush from Rosemary & Co. So it's a long, thin brush with a lovely sharp point. I load up the brush, and then where I want the paint to flow into all those little recesses that we've got where it's the etched out designs on the model, you just press the paintbrush against those little recesses, and the paint naturally flows into all those little gaps, almost like a contrast paint, but we're using this white. It takes moments to dry. If you put too much on, you can just use a little cotton bud or your finger just to wipe the paint away. And the idea here is I want just to work around the model, picking out all the little areas where I want my glowing effects to be coming from. So where we've got that pure white intenseness, that's where the most glow is going to be. So the whiter the area, the more the fluorescent paints will react against it and create that glow that we want. So the main job here, work around the model, adding in all those glowing effects where you want. Remember just to add in, just to tap the brush against those central points. You can see here really clearly how it works. The capillary action is really good. If you wanted to get even more capillary action, you'd actually go over the top of the areas in a gloss varnish, because then it reacts really well, it flows really neatly. But I find the contrast paints leave a glossy type finish anyway, so there isn't necessarily a need for that, but you can sometimes, I do go over it with a gloss varnish just so you get a better capillary action. But for this there wasn't. I did a test area and it was working really well. I would also then give it a good maybe up to 30 minutes to dry. It really just depends on the temperature, how thick or thin you've made the oil-based paints. They can take hours to dry properly, but to apply paint over the top, it can just take minutes to dry, and you can use a hairdryer to make it a bit better. But as I said, we're in the middle of a heat wave. It was drying very, very quickly. But the finger test will usually do it, or when it loses that shine, that's when you know it's dry. Usually I would say a minimum 10 to 15 minutes, much like a wash would take on a model if you were using a normal wash. The next process, I'm going to be using some AK Intense White on the wet palette. And what I do want to do here now is just to intensify some of the white areas. There are a few power nodes dotted around the model. So what we've done is we've created a glow inside the recesses. But now what I want to do is some of these areas that are like the power nodes that aren't a recess, they're a raised area. I just want to add some white into those just so that we create a deeper, like where the power is actually coming from into those nodes. So I just add this on the power nodes that are around the model, and any areas where I really want it to be intensely white, I just add a few dots of this, but this is mainly on the raised areas. And once we've done that, we're going to go back to the airbrush, back to the Liquitex white ink that we used originally when we did the armour. Now I'm painting the entirety of the flame, but as you can see, I want pure white at the base of the flame. That's where the most intense heat is coming from. Let's pretend this smoke is coming from fire, not from magic. And then I have a sort of gradient it away from the top of the smoke where it would be darker. Very subtle here. You could just paint the whole thing intensely white and then we can add the shading effects a little bit later. But I just wanted just to have it so that you can see we're sort of adding volumes of white. So the more intense white is where it's going to be hotter, and then it gradients itself out towards the tip of the smoke. I'm aiming the airbrush at the model so that we don't get too much overspray coming down the spear. I just want a little bit of overspray on where the smoke would be catching on the sort of tip of the spear. remembering trying not to catch any on the rest of the armour. I didn't want a big intense sort of glowing effects coming from the spear onto the armour, because I want the armour to be glowing from the sort of magic that's coming from inside of the armour, from the psychic that's coming from the armour. So the main goal here is to do the spray on the actual effect coming from the spear. And then what I want to do is, just so that we can get some blending going from the white ink that we've added inside the recesses, I'm just doing a few little oversprays, haloing effect sprays around the model. Now remember that when you spray from the airbrush, you get an intensity in the center point of the nozzle, and then it halos itself out, so you get those little gradient effects. So all I'm doing here is, where I want that to happen, I'm just pointing the airbrush into the central areas, so the nozzle is pointing centrally, a couple of sprays, and you get that nice little halo effect happening, where then the white ink is just gradually spraying outwards, so that you get a blend from the pure color and then out to that nice gradiented effect. A little bit on the power nodes, you'll be able to see where you need it to happen based on how that ink has settled into those areas. Not too much here, because the fluorescent paints we're going to use is going to help get rid of any sort of nasty areas you've created. If there's a horrid sort of white ink to the blue armor, this contrast, the fluorescent colors will hide a bit of that. So go and wash your airbrush out, let it dry for a little bit. Now we're going to be using some Green Stuff World Fluorescent Rose, which is a more red magenta. If you wanted to have pure magenta, just use AK Fluorescent Magenta, but I find this Fluorescent Rose from Green Stuff World has a subtle reddish purpleness to it that suits really well for these psychic effects. So all I do now is I'm basically spraying quite a lot of the armour as well here, but I'm trying to focus on the white that we've just created, and we're just spraying this Fluorescent Rose colour all over the white lining that we've just done, and also the entirety of the flame effect coming from the tip of the spear. Just take a little bit of care, try not to spray too much of the armour. Try and think here is, where would that magenta fluorescent rose colour that we're using, how would that work against the armour? So I do a little bit of overspray here and there, just to help it blend from the pure white into the blue of the armour. Just getting a little bit of coverage. Try not too much. We still want some of that blue to show through, but just remembering that you would get some sort of shine effect happening from that psychic magic onto the armour itself. Again, short sharp sprays, don't try and flood the area straight away. It's like layering with a brush. Many layers make the effect work. So short sharp sprays, then move away onto the next area. Just work around the model, adding more and more layers as you go. Don't try and cover it all in one go, because it won't work and it will flood and pool and look horrible. Just many layers as you work around. As you can see, don't worry about the white that's happening there. That's just where the camera and the lighting that I'm using, it's so bright that it whites out. But when you're painting in your normal daylight, that won't be happening. This is where I use a lot of bright lights, so you can capture a lot of the images. It looks like it's white. So now what I want to do is cool down some of the brightness, especially around the smoke. And for that, we're using Green Stuff World Fluorescent Violet. It's a very dark fluorescent colour. Works well. This is the natural darkening tone to your sort of magentas. So obviously, like a smoke, it'll be darker at the tips than it is at the tip. At the point of sort of heat, where there's at the end of the spear. So now what I'm doing is, again, using the angles of the model and the angles of the brush, I'm darkening down the tip of the spear, the smoke effect, just so that goes a nice deep violet colour. So it shows that it's getting cooler. And I will also point this into areas on the model himself, on the Librarian, where I just want that magenta just to cool down a little bit. Not directly where the glowing is coming from, but the areas surrounding it, so that we get a sort of natural gradient effect from that pure fluorescent rose out to the violet and then back onto that blue armour. Not too much, but it's nice to add some of this darker colour, because adding darkness intensifies your brightness, and having brightness intensifies your darker areas. So the two work in unison with each other. If everything was a highlight, there would be no highlight. If everything was dark, there'd be no dark. So without dark, you can't have light. Without light, you can't have darkness. So just work around those areas, adding a little bit of that fluorescent violet into those dark areas and the tip of the smoke. Now, to really darken down the smoke effect, we've got some AK Tenebrous Grey. Now here I didn't wash out the brush, the airbrush. I'm adding the Tenebrous Grey straight in, and so you get like a dark violet Tenebrous Grey mix. A little bit of airbrush thinner just to thin it down, because Tenebrous Grey is quite a thick paint. And I'm just now focusing on the very tip of the smoke, pointing the airbrush directly towards the tips of the smoke, and then downwards so it catches the tips of those smoke trails, and trying to keep it well away from that intense glowing area from the central point of the end of the spear. So this is now just showing that the tip of the smoke is very, very dark, almost like a normal flame, like fire smoke would be very, very dark. This is the same with the sort of the magic that we're trying to show here, that red, that like fluorescent rosy magenta that's coming from the tip of the spear. It's really, really intense at where it's coming from, and then darkening down at the edge where it's cooling down. So that's it with the airbrush. We're now going to move down back to the brushwork. And for this, I've got a little magic mix to make our contrast ink, which is 1 part Vallejo white ink, 1 part contrast medium, and 1 part water mixed together. You create a sort of contrast paint, white. You could just use thinned down white paint, but I find that then goes a little bit chalky. By adding in the contrast medium, it sort of keeps the pigment together, stops it from splitting too much. And what we're doing with this is now we're adding back in the intensity of the glowing effect. So because I want the intense glow to be orange, and so to get that nice bright orange, we're adding back in some white that we can paint over it with the fluorescent orange. If you didn't want to do the orange and you wanted just to keep it going in the magenta-y pink, still do this step, but just go back over the top of it in the fluorescent magenta or the fluorescent rose. And like a contrast paint, this will pool in the recesses, and like a sort of glaze that we're doing, where you drag the paint is where the most paint will be left. So when you remove your brush, where you've left the brush is where the most paint will be left. So always drag this into the areas where you want the most intensity to be. I want the intensity to be growing from those power nodes, from the central points of the runes that are around. So wherever you want it to be really, really bright, just add a few drops of this little white mix that we've got to increase it. I then move back to just normal AK intense white and add a few dots of that onto the power nodes where I want it to be really, really bright. So what really works well with these fluorescent rose, fluorescent magentas is orange. I found it creates a really sort of ethereal, dark, psychic magic type look. So AK fluorescent orange, Green Stuff World fluorescent orange is equally as good. I just find the AK one is a little bit thicker and has a bit more pigment to it, but the Green Stuff World fluorescent orange is just as good. Straight onto the wet palette, and now what we do is we apply this both onto the white that we've just added and a little bit of the surrounding areas, so you'll get a sort of glazing effect from that fluorescent rose magenta into the fluorescent orange. And yeah, just carefully add this over all of those white that we've just added and a little bit on the surrounding areas, so that you get a nice transition between the fluorescent colours. You may need a couple of layers just to cover that white, but as you can see, it gives a really great effect. So we've got a nice fluorescent glow coming from the heat of that spear and then emanating from the runes of his armour, and it works really well against the blue. So just work around the model. You could use some Tenebrous Grey as well if you wanted to darken down the spear even more. Just use some thinned down Tenebrous Grey just to add as the smoke effect. So that's quite a bulk of the model done. We're now just going to move on to the cloak and the tabard. And for that, and this is also the leather colour as well, so anything where you want to be leather. I'm just using some AK Dark Sea Blue, which is a very dark blue with its little bit of grey to it. And all I'd be doing here is this first layer is over the black. So the idea could be now, where you've done all this airbrushing and there's been overspray here, there and everywhere, is just go back over and clean up the model. So anything that has got overspray, anything that's not the blue armor or the magic, just paint over in your matte black or very dark primer color that you're going to be using. The dark sea blue, as you can see, is quite a thick layer. This is our first highlight. There's no need to go from the black in, like make a mix of the black to the dark sea blue. The dark sea blue is very close. So all I'm doing here is doing my first layer highlight over any of the larger areas and any of the raised areas in this dark sea blue. It's got a little bit of water to it, probably one drop of water to a few drops of paint, just to thin it down and make it pliable. On the larger panels of the cloak, thin the paint down a little bit more and work that almost a slightly thicker glaze, probably a 50-50, maybe a 70-30 in favour of paint. It just helps get those transitions from the black to the dark sea blue, and it means once again that you'll get that nice effect of the colour layering much more easily, more naturally, from that dark colour to the dark sea blue. And again, where we leave the paintbrush, the most paint will be left, so I'm just aiming that paint towards the bottom of the cloak and the edges of those raised areas, just so you get nice transitions happening. Very easy, very quick. Again, I don't want to go too bright with any highlights now, because I want our bright points to be from the glow that we've created, not anything else. So that's why I generally do all the glowing effects first, because that creates your maximum highlight. Now we can just work to slightly below that so that we don't take the effect away. To start just making our next highlight on the cloak, I use some vampiric flesh. Now, using these desaturated flesh colours as a highlight colour means what you're actually doing is you're creating a desaturated highlight, which both creates the highlight but just gives it sort of an idea that there's wear and tear on the sort of cloak and leather. So we don't just go for like a lighter grey or a lighter blue grey. which still has the colour to it. What we're doing with a desaturated highlight, I find it adds just some natural wear and tear, and gives the impression of a highlight, but not a coloured highlight, which can sometimes be a bit too bright. So I just work around now, and this is almost an edge highlight, picking out those high ridges, picking out the knuckles and the fingers on the gloves. But again, not too bright. This isn't really even 50-50. This is probably more 70-30. It's only a tiny drop of vampiric flesh into this. If you're using Warhammer colours, it would be a sort of Kislev flesh, pallid witch flesh. Probably not Kislev flesh, that might be a bit too pink, but like a pallid witch flesh or a flayed one flesh. Any pale colour. You could try a bone colour like Ushabti bone or Screaming Skull, but this AK vampiric flesh is a nice desaturated colour that takes well to any colour you add to it, blues, pinks, reds, to get this desaturated, worn highlight look. But as you can see, we've already got quite a bright highlight from a very, very subtle addition of some light colour to it. And if I wanted to do larger highlights like we've got on those flatter panels there, I just thin the paint down with water to create a glaze, so that then you get a nice transition from your first primer up into your first highlight and this second highlight here. And like a glaze, as you can see, glazing up to where you want your highlight to finish means that's where most paint will be left. And it's just that rule to keep drumming in: where you leave the paintbrush, the most paint will be left. It's a great rule to remember, especially on glazes, because then you'll know you paint downwards towards your edge highlight will naturally create your gradient effect. Paint upwards towards a raised highlight, and then you get that natural effect of the colour increasing where the area is getting brighter. And even on these desaturated wear and tear highlights, it's the same principle. It's getting brighter where the light is reflecting off of it more. It's just that where the light is now reflecting, it's just revealing that it's got wear and tear, it's desaturated, there's not much colour left in the old cloak anymore. Or the cloak is a very, very dark black blue colour, so the highlights just need to reflect that. Just using some AK graphite And this is what I'm using to highlight the areas that were black, which is the sort of hoses and pipes that are just dotted around, mainly on his chest and just coming out the bottoms of his gloves. Just a few little, it's almost dry brushing those highlights. You could use the dark sea blue mixes, but I just wanted these to just be slightly subtly different, and so they're just a mid-tone grey. There's a small piece of silver, so for that I'm using AK gunmetal, which is a nice dark metallic colour. There's a little chain of keys just hanging from his waist. All the other metallics I'm going to be doing as gold, but just for the silver I'm just using AK gunmetal, which is slightly darker than lead boucher, maybe an Iron Warriors or Iron Breaker if you're using the Warhammer range. So for the golds, I base coat in AK Rusty Gold, which is slightly darker than a Balthazar Gold, maybe a Gehenna's Gold, but I find Rusty Gold is good. It's really, really dark, but very rich. It's still got a nice gold look to it, and it's almost, it goes well with the effects we're trying to do. We've got a sort of dark, foreboding looking miniature that we're painting here, and the lighting around all the glowing effects is almost looking like it's heavily tarnished, heavily worn, heavily heated up, and left with a sort of sooty after finish to it. And I find this rusty gold gives that really gold effect, but it looks like it's been a bit worn and battered. Not too rich, but not too desaturated. It's just got a good balance with it, this colour. So I just work around now and base coat with the rusty gold. The staff has a pattern around it. You've got the handle here, which is just normal sort of round, but there's a sort of an etched pattern on the main shaft of the spear. So I'm almost dry brushing the gold onto that now, just so that we get the gold over the top and the dark black primer underneath it. I'm going straight to do a highlight now. I don't do any washes, and I just use AK Old Gold. And I don't use too much of this. It's a very, very bright gold. I just add a few little highlights here and there where I think that the sunlight would just be naturally catching some of the gold areas, just on the very tops. Again, not too much here. I didn't want it to go too bright because then it would just detract from the glowing effect that we've created. So just for the wax seals and parchment, for the wax seals I use AK Magenta as a base coat and then highlight with AK Intense Pink. And for the parchments themselves, I base coat in AK Mud Brown and then do a highlight in AK Light Earth. For these, things like Steel Legion Drab, Xandri Dust, Ushabti Bone, any sort of neutral brown and stony type colours works well with parchments. You could then go really up even higher and use a sort of AK Deck Tan or Screaming Skull to get it even brighter on the parchments. But again, like I said, I wanted to keep the highlights toned down on this, so I'm just going down a level of my highlights, not going too bright. So for the Librarian's face, we're going to be adding a few more glowing effects to it, but I'm just using a mid-tone flesh colour for his face, which is the Kislev flesh. I thin the paint down, and a few layers is all that's needed. Once that is dry, I then do a wash with Reichland Flesh Shade. Sometimes I find that you need 2 goes with the Reichland Flesh Shade, just so do 1 layer and then add another layer on top, just to get a good coverage, good definition in the recesses. I also find that sometimes whilst washes are drying, I want to move on to other areas, and just, in areas that I want to do highlights to, I just can move over too quick. Because there's not too many highlights to do on the blue armour whilst that flesh wash is drying, I use AK Ducat Blue, and all I'm doing here is just doing very simple edge highlights of the blue armour. There isn't too much to do because we've got a lot of like those ethereal magic highlights already over the top. This is just picking out any of the raised areas and edges that are exposed. So just work around the model. There's some on the sort of front. As I said, there's not too many to do here, and I find this Ducat Blue is just a nice mid-tone highlight, and this is as bright as we'll go on the armour. Like I say, we want to maintain the bright points from the magic, not on anything else, so this is the brightest highlight we do on the armour. So I want to add in a different tone to his flesh. So I make a wash using AK Wine Red. It's a very, very water heavy wash because wine red is a very, very intense colour. So it's one little drop of paint to maybe 10 drops of water. You could use Carroburg Crimson or Volupus Pink from Warhammer, but again they have to be extremely heavily diluted. Doesn't matter even if you over dilute it, you can always do multiple layers. But I find for flesh, the AK Wine Red or the Carroburg Crimson give a nice pinkish fleshy feel to the model, to the face. It also adds what looks like areas of strain or stress onto the face as well. And again, whilst that's drying, I now just want to add a few more areas of glow. As I've been looking at the model, I just want to add a few more hints of the sort of glowing effect happening where it's reflecting off some of the metallics. So to do that, I just base coat those areas in a little bit of AK Intense White. This was primarily going to be used just on the keys that are on his waist. I wanted it to look like the glow is reflecting off of some of that silver. So I just add a little bit of this AK Intense White where I want that reflections to be, but only adding it into the central points of that reflection, just leaving space either side where I could still add some of the fluorescent paint, but it won't be as bright, so it looks like the glow is dissipating from the central glow outwards. So I've gone back to the Green Stuff World Fluorescent Rose, or if you were using any magenta, so this is basically our base fluorescent colour. And I'm just going to go over the areas we've just painted white in that fluorescent rose colour, and also a little bit of the surrounding area. So where you've done a couple of dots of white, just overlap it a little bit either side, so you get a nice transition from the sort of base colour of the gold into that fluorescent rose. Time you've done that, all of the flesh washes should be nice and dry, and I'm just going to reintroduce our Kislev flesh as the base colour, just so that we get the transitions from the dark area in the recesses. So I'm focusing now on the top of the cheeks, the eyebrows, the nose, and any creases around his mouth. So like you do with edge highlights on armour, you're sort of edge highlighting the face, but you're just picking out those raised areas. I don't go too bright with the highlight on the face. I try and keep it slightly muted because we're going to have glowing effects coming from his eyes that I didn't want to get lost. So to do the glowing effects coming from his eyes, I base coat first the area of his eye and the eye socket itself in the AK magenta. Then I add on the eye itself a little drop of AK Intense Pink. Then I add a little dot of white inside of the eye, and then cover the area in the AK fluorescent, in the Green Stuff World Fluorescent Rose. So it's the same premise that we've got as our standard glowing effects around the model, where we've got the darker colour as our cooler colour and the bright colour as our heat. So where I imagine the central pupil of the eye is going to be the hottest point, that's where it would be the fluorescent rose, and the white would cover it. I then do the same on the vent on the backpack on the back, where we just went over it. We just use a little bit of magenta, a little bit of white, and then the fluorescent rose on the back, just so it looks like that psychic magic is coming from the vents as well on the back. What I'm doing here on the base of the Librarian, I've just using some thinned down magenta, and before all of that, I've actually dry brushed. I've added the sort of effect of the dry brushing onto the base itself. So with that, I've used AK Grim Brown dry brush, AK Mud Brown dry brush, and then AK Light Earth, focusing the AK Light Earth on the tips of the rocks. So that's the brightest point. I then go over the top of all that in some watered down AK magenta, just so it turns it that subtle purplish colour. It is a glaze, so it's not very pigment rich, just a subtle glaze, just to start getting that transition. I then hit over the top of that with the Green Stuff World Fluorescent Rose. So you're going to be doing a wash of the magenta just to start turning it that purple reddish colour, and then the Fluorescent Rose over the top with We'll then work with the dry brushing highlights to create some of the glow. Then I do a subtle edge highlight of where I want it to be most bright with some pure white, and then over the top of that pure white I hit it with the AK fluorescent orange. So again, it's matching the colours we've been using for our glowing effects, but now that it's just shown that the tip of those rocks are reflecting some of the light coming from the psychic spear that we've got. So that's a wash of magenta, then do a coating with the fluorescent rose on a smaller area, then a subtle edge highlight with white, and then go over the top of that with the AK fluorescent orange. It gives a sort of reflecting effect on the very tip, but not too much, because again we want all of the real effects to be coming from the armour and the spear itself. With the little bit of fluorescent orange now, I just work around the model and just see where I just need to just add a little bit here and there where I might not have had good coverage at first, or I just want to increase the glowing effect. This is where I'm just finishing off the eyes with a little bit of that fluorescent orange. This is where the model is now pretty complete. You can start getting an idea of where you need to add your intensity of glowing effects. Do the nodes stand out as the bright point? If not, add a little dot of white and a little bit more of the fluorescent colour onto it. I'm just adding in here where there are some sort of stark highlights, and you can just add a little bit of your base colours like the dark sea blue or the tenebrous grey just to darken them down a little bit. I also find that sometimes just intensifying the reflections on metallic areas helps sell the fact that they are metallic, because you find that a metal will reflect more than a sort of non-metallic area. So gold would reflect more than on a cotton cloak, for instance, or a material-based cloak. So if your highlights are nice and rich and strong on your golds and silvers, it helps sell the effects that we're going for. You can also, if you want here, water down some dark tenebrous grey or corvus black or even abaddon black, and just glaze that into your shadow areas. If you wanted just to decrease the blue armour a little bit, you can just glaze that into those areas just to help sell it. So there we go. Couple of hours it's probably taken, and we've got ourselves quite an awesome looking librarian onto the battlefield. If you're going to be using it as in tournaments or whatever, and of course you can't have too bigger effects coming from the spear, you could not have the flame effect coming from the spear, but just do the same effect coming from the eyes of the skull just to help sell the effect, but you can still have the armour effects going. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. You can use this across, I said, any of the Space Marine factions, even Age of Sigmar, anything this will work against. As always, like, comment and subscribe. The colours that I used are shown not only in the description of the video, but there's also a end screen coming up which has got a list of all the colours I used plus the tools that I've used as well. Yeah, like, comment and subscribe, and happy painting, my fellow painters.
Yeah.